So yes, I'm going to speak about neoliberal militarism and social movement resistance in Guatemala. And it's actually extremely exciting to be doing this today. As some of you may know, today marked the start of Guatemala's genocide trials. And I'll be speaking more about those. But today in court, survivors of genocide and their lawyers confronted the generals who implemented the scorched earth genocide of the 1980s in Guatemala, and that's ongoing. Today also marks, I believe, the 31st anniversary of the firebombing of the Spanish embassy in Guatemala, in which many activists were killed by the Guatemalan state. So as Michael mentioned, I worked for the last 2 years with Network in Solidarity with the People of Guatemala, NISGUA, as coordinator of our Guatemala Accompaniment project. And you can learn more about NISGUA online at our website, nisgua.org. And I'll be speaking a little bit more about our work throughout the presentation. But first I wanted to give you just a brief overview of what our Accompaniment project is. We provide trained international observers to work alongside Guatemalan human rights and social movement activists as part of a network of organizations from across North America and Europe called Accompaniment. Accompaniment also has a website at accompaniment.org with reports in Spanish about observation work. And we have at least one former member of the Accompaniment project here. Anyone else who I don't know? And how many folks actually here have some experience with Guatemala, or from Guatemala, have been there? A good number. And then other Latin America experiences, I'm sure counts for a lot of other folks. So what our Accompaniment project does is provide a dissuasive physical presence alongside Guatemalans working for human rights and social justice. You can see in this photo 2 of our observers accompanying a representative from the Survivors Association for Justice and Reconciliation, who is the group who's the plaintiffs in the genocide trial. We also accompany offices of those organizations and document and analyze local contexts for potential and ongoing human rights abuses in order to disseminate that information internationally in the hopes of using that demonstration of international solidarity and awareness to deter further human rights violations. This is a example, another in-action example. A lot of the work is actually more based on a sort of moral support and person-to-person solidarity. We spend a lot of time with folks in their homes. This is accompaniers speaking with former president of the Association for Justice and Reconciliation in his home. And we visit the communities where witnesses in the genocide trials live and where communities are resisting the imposition of harmful mega development projects. We also accompany labor and campesino or peasant rights organizations in urban and rural areas. So I wanted to start out by describing to you a recent event that I think illustrates in the starkest possible terms the stakes for social movements in Guatemala. And that's what happened in a place called Totonicapan last October. On October 4th of last year, the indigenous authorities of the 48 communities of Totonicapan called a protest against high energy prices, against a constitutional reform proposal, and against changes to the teaching curriculum for the teaching curriculum for high schoolers, basically, who are going to become future teachers. Reform proposals that have not been consulted with indigenous populations or the population of Guatemala as a whole at all. And they carried out this protest by blocking highways on the Inter-American Highway in a place called Cuatro Caminos, which is a point where you can basically block all of the traffic on the Inter-American Highway at that point more or less here outside Quetzaltenango and Totonicapán. And as those communities were peacefully blockading the highway, their representatives, including Carmen Takam, who's the youngest woman leader of the 48 communities ever to have been chosen, were awaiting a meeting with the government in Guatemala City. And then without any negotiation, the police attacked demonstrators. In the fighting that followed, as people tried to defend themselves from the police and also from security guards from a private company that opened fire on the demonstration, a military patrol arrived at the site and soldiers fired on the crowd. 8 people were killed. 6 of them were shown later to have been killed by bullets fired by Guatemalan army soldiers. 2 of the others may have been killed by a private security guard. This was the largest massacre in Guatemala committed by the military since the 1996 peace accords. And marks, I think, a watershed moment for polarization between grassroots social movements and the government in Guatemala, in peacetime Guatemala. The reaction to that was immediate and extremely vocal. Large groups across civil society condemned the government, called for the removal of the interior minister and other government officials who had responsibility for the security forces on that day. And since then, the soldiers who fired on the crowd have actually been arrested and are being processed, but no higher-ups in the chain of command have had any repercussions for the killing of unarmed protesters. And I think some 30 people at least were injured as well. Reactions to the massacre also included several weeks later at the October 20th Revolution Day protest, which is usually a peaceful civil society march. Activists covered shoes in red paint and spilled them out in the street in front of the Interior Ministry headquarters, which is the former headquarters of the National Police, a torture facility for generations that's in the middle of Guatemala City. And there was damage done to the installations of the Interior Ministry. And I mention this because similarly to what folks here in the Northwest are facing for acts of property damage, there's been a manhunt for activists who were involved in those protests in Guatemala. And I think what is important to note about that, there's also been closing of ranks amongst social movement and human rights organizations to say criminalization of social discontent is not the answer when the army and police are killing people. And so I want to just consider this analysis by a Guatemalan, a longtime Guatemalan historian and analyst, Carlos Figueroa Ibarra, who after the protest in Totonicapán wrote in an article titled "Habits of Counterinsurgency and Neoliberal Dogma," the objective of this unrestrained violence is not just to put a stop to discontent in Totonicapán, but to spread the terror that is necessary to disarticulate growing protests against open-pit mining, hydroelectric dams, cement factories, highways, and crops like African palm. And I want to kind of interrogate this thesis, because what we know about the events in Totonicapán are actually that the military patrol that shot at the protesters had been told by police that they weren't needed at the demonstration, and they actually the military went against police orders when they arrived there and shot at the protesters. And there's we couldn't say that there's proof that these actions are specifically done with the intention to generate this kind of terror. But in the context of the experience on the ground as it's lived by communities that are affected by things like mining, their reality is one of low-level state terror. And that's what we're going to sort of look at in this presentation as well. And I want to start by just giving a basic overview of Guatemalan history, beginning with the fact that it's territory that was invaded by colonizers some 500 years ago. When the Spanish invaders arrived in Guatemala, they found a dense network of city-states and communities and proceeded to subjugate them through divide and conquer tactics. From the Spanish conquest to the 17th century, the population of Central America was reduced from about 2 million to 128,000 through disease, war, and enslavement. And that's the foundation for, as we know, all the modern nation states in the Western Hemisphere. Guatemala became independent from the Spanish crown in 1815, basically because of elite rebellion against taxation and against the strictures that the crown put on exactly how much local elites could exploit the local population and resources. And actually, I'll go back to this. I didn't explain this photo. The statue is of Atanasio Tzul, who was a leader of the 48 communities of Totonicapán in the 18th century, and who led a revolt against Spanish taxation that won significant rights of autonomy for the 48 communities of Totonicapán that continue to this day. And the black mourning cape was put on the statue following the massacre in Totonicapán last October. The next sort of main moment in the ongoing process of genocide in Guatemala could be located in 1871 in what's called the Liberal Reform, which is when the liberal elite of Guatemala basically decided to modernize the economy around an agricultural export model, so based on bananas, based on coffee, based on cotton, and other primary commodities, and carried out a second wave of displacement of the indigenous population from the best agricultural land in the country. And I'll map it out a little bit. Does anyone have sensitivity? Should I use? Okay. So basically, to this day, the best agricultural land is the South Coast, and also there was a lot of settlement sort of in this area also, in which the population was displaced from the land in order to establish the massive plantations that that still exist today. And through this process, really is when the modern nation state of Guatemala came to exist. And the state used to the fullest its repressive powers to ensure an economy based on the subjugation of the majority indigenous Maya population. So through things like vagrancy laws, which said anyone who doesn't have a registered employer in your ID card, you'll be put to work for X amount of months a year on road building. You have to have given a certain amount of days work to a boss every year, otherwise you'll be conscripted into government servitude. It set up a model of seasonal migration to plantations, and the majority of the indigenous population was pushed, that didn't already live in the highlands, was pushed into the highlands onto the most marginal land. We can see in this period, through the period of the conquest and liberal reform, how the current racial hierarchy of Guatemala was established, in which the majority indigenous population is subordinated to the mestizo or Ladino class, but which is also in turn subordinated to the European Creole elite, which was a very small percentage of the population which has a concept of a racist concept of whiteness as the basis for economic and political power. I'm going to try to go a bit faster through this. By the early 20th century, labor movements and left-wing political movements were starting to gain hold in Guatemala, including socialist, communist, and anarchist tendencies. And in 1944, a general strike ousted the dictator Ubico, who was, on the one hand, a fascist, on the other hand, was very submissive to the United States, gave huge concessions to the United Fruit Company, for example, which was on the previous slide. And in that relationship, we see the roots of today's neoliberalism, giving tax exemptions, giving all these investment incentives to transnational companies to extract wealth. And the United Fruit Company actually had a monopoly basically on the productive infrastructure of Guatemala, including the ports both on the south and north coast, and the railway system was owned by United Fruit Company as a private corporation. Following the 1944 revolution, the democratically elected governments of Arevalo and Arbenz instituted reforms, including the Social Security Administration, including raising the minimum wage, including legalizing labor unions and independent political parties, including the Communist Party, and passed an agrarian reform law which purchased from large landowners their unused land. And the United Fruit Company held actually about 80% of the land that it had held it fallow, just as accumulated land. And they bought the land from United Fruit Company at the value it had stated for tax purposes, which was, of course, extremely understated. This 10 years of spring, as it's called in Guatemala, was ended in 1954 by a coup engineered by the U.S. State Department and CIA, which at that time were under the leadership of the Dulles brothers, who were also shareholders and lawyers for United Fruit Company. This mural by Diego Rivera depicts the coup by Castillo Armas, who was a exile from Guatemala who raised a mercenary army in Honduras that invaded Guatemala with the help of the CIA and State Department. And you can see in the painting Eisenhower on the bomb and the Dulles brothers shaking the hand of the liberator Castillo Armas. Che Guevara actually was in Guatemala at the time of the counter-revolution and was one of the events in his life that contributed to his radicalization. The complete closure of any democratic space for political change was one of the factors that led to the beginning of armed struggle with the rebellion of progressive military officers in the 1960s, who were inspired by the model of the Cuban Revolution and also incensed by the fact that Guatemalan territory was used as the launching place for the Bay of Pigs invasion. And I include these photos by Janauary Simon, who's an amazing photographer who was in Guatemala during the 80s and who embedded with the guerrilla movements, because they, I think, speak very eloquently to the amount of risk that people took and in making the decision to engage in armed struggle. You have the young man in the urban guerrilla movement in his childhood bedroom, it looks like. You have the indigenous members of the Guerrilla Army of the Poor training with sticks. And for 36 years, the internal armed conflict basically ruled existence in the country. After the counter-revolution, the CIA provided lists to the military of labor and political leaders to be disposed of. And I think importantly, There is a transition from sort of the personalist strongman dictatorships of the 40s and earlier to an elite military oligarchy pact in which the military was even more clearly a tool for economic control. The response of the military to the possibility of an armed uprising, particularly once the guerrilla movements moved into indigenous regions of the country, was a campaign of massacres, particularly from 1979 to 1983. The tactic known as scorched earth, which destroyed more than 400 communities and resulted in more than 600 individual massacres. This was based on an inversion of Mao's statement about guerrilla warfare that the people are the sea in which the revolutionaries swim. The Guatemalan military decided, well, if you can't kill the fish, then you drain the sea. And so the logic was to attack the civilian population, which was a potential support base for the guerrilla, rather than just attacking people who were specifically members of the revolutionary movements. This isn't a picture from that time of what scorched earth looked like, burning everything in a community, killing old people, women, children, destroying crops, homes. And this created more than 1 million displaced people throughout the country. This next photo is a hard one to look at. This is a photo from an ongoing exhumation at a Guatemalan military base in Coban, which is more or less here-ish, where people were taken by the Guatemalan military to be tortured and interrogated and killed and buried in mass graves. To date, they've discovered more than 500 remains inside a military base that remains in use today for UN peacekeeper training missions and US humanitarian missions. It also included the concentration of the rural population in what were called model villages, which was based on the strategic hamlets strategy used by the United States in Vietnam to bring the population together basically in rural concentration camps where the speaking of indigenous languages was prohibited, where evangelical Christianity was imposed on the population, where people were forced, were put into forced work, and also forced to become paramilitaries across the entire countryside. Just want to mention two aspects of this counterinsurgency strategy that are key to understanding the genocide. One was that the strategy never was to eliminate 100% of the Mayan population. That, of course, would be absurd, because then who would migrate seasonally to the plantations to provide labor? The strategy was a 70%, 30% beans and bullets campaign. So you control 70% of the population by giving them food and development, and you kill the other 30% of the population that are the potential support base for revolution. And there's a military document called Operation Ixil, which was based in the central Quiché region, more or less here-ish. This is a photo from the Ixil that said that specifically the Maya Ixil people are foreign to the Guatemalan identity, and it said that the military should carry out to the fullest its efforts to intensify the Ladinization of the Ixilles, so they disappear as a cultural subgroup foreign to our national way of life. This whole campaign was instituted by soldiers trained and assessed by the US military. Military aid was suspended in 1979 by Carter, but reinstated by Reagan. I also want to show this is from some excerpts from a document called the Death Squad dossier, which is a list of activists who were put under surveillance, detained, and executed by the Guatemalan military. These are two people whose remains actually have been identified in a military base outside Guatemala City. And you can see on the each of these cards has a code here that says 300, which was code for that person has been executed. And so over 36 years, the outcome in numbers of this is more than 200,000, some say up to 250,000 victims, the majority of whom were Mayan people. Some of the other numbers I've already mentioned. 40,000 people were forcibly disappeared, which is to say detained by the security forces and never heard from again. And 93% of the violations were determined by the Truth Commissions to have been carried out by military and state or paramilitary forces, and maybe some 6% by the guerrilla. The number of massacres by department maps out exactly on the area of the country that has the highest percentage of indigenous population. And we'll return possibly this map later. And I think this is where we can start to talk again about neoliberal militarism, because this moment of the 1980s around the world is where we see the shift to neoliberalism taking place. And it's actually quite shocking to compare, as I will on the next slides, the number of killings and disappearings. This is per month by regime. So you see the Rios Montt regime of 1982, 1983 was by far, had the most killings in a short period of time, in 16 months. Graphed across the whole conflict, you can see the spike in 1982 and 1983 as the counterinsurgency plan of scorched earth was implemented. And this maps actually exactly onto when international financial institutions began giving huge multi-million-dollar loans to the Guatemalan government for massive development projects that had been identified by the military and by the political elite as important for Guatemala's economic transition. The archetypal and the most notorious of these is the Chicxoy Dam on the Chicxoy River. More than $100 million in loans by the World Bank were provided for this project, which was directly associated with the massacre of more than 400 people and 30 communities that were either destroyed by scorched earth or inundated by the project. And this is what folks who are facing the imposition of dams and other kinds of mega projects today have in mind as their example of what these kind of projects bring. 30 years later, the communities of Rio Negro have not received any reparations, although there have been many agreements that say they should receive reparations. And the folks who live closest to the side of the dam still don't even have electricity. And this is the biggest dam in Guatemala. It's like 200 some megawatts. The war ended officially in 1996, but the peace accords are generally seen to have failed to address the root causes of the conflict, which are the racist structure of society and rampant inequality. What the conflict left, among other things, was a legacy of impunity in which 97% of violent crimes go without investigation. The Guatemalan government was described by Amnesty as a corporate mafia state in 2004. So things like military intelligence structures that were never fully dismantled moved from the state into organized crime, but maintained influence within the state. And there's many examples of this. One of the best readings about what impunity and violence looks like in Guatemala following the peace accords is Francisco Goldman's book, The Art of Political Murder, which is about the 1998 assassination of Bishop Juan Gerardi, who was a human rights advocate. So part of the transition in the economic and political structure of Guatemala that occurs basically from the 70s to the present day is that the elite families of the oligarchy become corporations and have merged with transnational capital. So you have the Pais family, for example, which is merged with, in his business ventures with Walmart. Pollo Campero is a fried chicken restaurant, but the company that owns it also invests in dams and other projects. The Castillo brewery, this is a mural from Guatemala's public university, San Carlos, that says "Blood, the flavor of Guatemala." They have the beer monopoly in Guatemala, and also our Pepsi manufacturers and distributors have a long history of labor rights violations. And the establishment of business lobbies, for example, CACIF is an influential one that was found to have more loyalty from Congress members than their own parties, and so can dictate a lot of the terms of political decisions. And I want to read a kind of long, dry political economy quote for you. Any political economy fans out there? From a guy named William I. Robinson. I'll just read this and then continue. So it was the threat of revolution from the popular classes that led to U.S. intervention. From the mid-1980s on, U.S. policymakers began to redefine in an ad hoc fashion the objective of interventionism from military defeat of the revolutionary forces to a more political and economic restructuring of the region via a link to emergent global structures. This included a shift to democracy promotion as a means to neutralize the revolutionary threat through incorporation. These changes in U.S. strategy helped to accelerate the articulation of alternative political ideological discourse and projects among sectors of the dominant groups that would gradually cohere into the new right elite. So this is the extremely brief description of the way in which the elite in Guatemala itself has been transformed through its linkages with the global economy. This was a project that the Guatemalan military was also bought into, sectors of the Guatemalan military. Guatemala's president today is Otto Pérez Molina, who's a former general. He was served on the ground in the Ixil region during the scorched earth, or during the 1980s. He's actually a moderate in the scheme of the Guatemalan military. He represents a part of the Guatemalan military that decided in the mid-80s that transitioning to democracy was the way to move Guatemala forward towards economic development, but that the military should maintain a central role in the state itself. And so his coming to power represents an attempt to institutionalize that vision of the military as a central actor within the state. And this is what Guatemalan analysts have identified today as neoliberal militarism. An emphasis on iron-handed security policy, the mano dura slogan, and a concentration of power in the executive branch. There's been many examples of, in just the first year of the Pérez Molina administration, of the government imposing proposals without any kind of consultation previously, and has led to, as I said earlier, more and more polarization between civil society and the state. As well as an intensification of the concession of natural resources to transnational corporations and implementation of tax policies and other measures that are intended to favor investors. So I want to stop looking at trying to describe the structure of the elite and of the state and move to talking about social movements, which is probably why we're all here. One first question would be, how do we define social movements? Unification behind a cause? What kind of cause? Any cause. Okay, so it could be any group of people who work together through, let's say, is it through a political party or through what means? I don't think there's a specific answer to this question, but it's important to interrogate what we mean by social movements. One definition that I've been interested in recently is from a guy named Raul Cipechi, who talks about not social movements, but societies in movement. So saying that the strongest social movements that exist, for example, in Latin America, are actually sectors of the society that are excluded from the dominant means of power and have to move from their inherited place in society in order to continue existing, in order to survive. And so this definition thinks about how social movements exist as relationships between actors involved in a struggle, in a common cause, as opposed to looking at just the idea of what demands are we making to the state. So what you were talking about, who was talking about how negotiation happens. So is a social movement just the mass of people who are blocking the highway while the leaders go and talk to the government about what their demands are? Or is the social movement something, is it that and also something broader than that? And I'm going to try to talk about two, although I've already talked longer on this section than I wanted to, but movements for justice and memory and for territorial defense. These are the movements that have led to the genocide trial that began today. I'm not going to spend a ton of time reviewing the details about how these cases have come about, but in the shortest way possible, we could say it's been 30 years since the massacres. It's been 10 years since the cases were launched in the judicial system. There was a 10-year, it's been more than 10 years, 12 years at least. 10 years of investigation, which was held up by non-cooperation of the legal system and by the defense lawyers of the generals. There's been a year of waiting for the trial to begin, and now the trial has started, and it could be over within a few, this phase of the trial could be over within a few days, and then there'll be appeals and on and on. I think what I would argue about the genocide cases is that they're not just, that they actually represent the result of a social movement of victim survivors of the genocide that have moved from their inherited place as victims into a place of protagonism as survivors and as actors who have moved from the struggle for justice into things like territorial defense and struggles for other causes. So these are some photos of the people who have made that possible, including both members of the legal team that supports the Survivors Association and members of the Association for Justice and Reconciliation, which brings together folks from 5 regions of the country where the Truth Commissions determined that acts of genocide had taken place. The plaintiffs, General Efrain Rios Montt, who was the head of state from March 82 to August 83. Oscar Mejia Victoris, who deposed Rios Montt in a coup after serving as his Minister of Defense. He's actually been found unfit to stand a trial because of health reasons, as you can see, a smoker. Mario Lopez Fuentes, who was Rios Montt's Army Chief of Staff, also currently claiming that he is unfit to stand trial due to health reasons. And Mauricio Rodriguez Sanchez, Director of Military Intelligence, who also today left the court hearing and went back to the military hospital claiming health issues. So the strategy of the defense for the last 10 years has basically been to put as many legal obstacles as possible so that they die before the justice can be achieved, basically. So last week, a judge in Guatemala decided that Rios Montt and Rodriguez Sanchez would go on trial for genocide, relating at the very least to 15 specific massacres which occurred in the Ixil region of Quiché, with 1,771 victims who were known by name and 250 whose remains have been identified. And the trial for genocide includes both command responsibility for the massacres that took place, as well as the population control measures that I talked about earlier, including the rural concentration camps, etc. And this is a quote from one of the representatives of the Survivors Association from last year when it began to become clear that these trials were going to happen. And I just want to talk about one part of it, which is we feel as if we could give eternal life to our loved ones because finally they're putting the person who's responsible for the massacres of our loved ones on trial. And so I think that, you know, in the context of living in a mass incarceration society in the United States, we often are very skeptical about what justice in the eyes of the state means, but I think we should also listen to folks like the survivors of genocide in Guatemala who are articulating what justice means to them in that context. As far as what this could mean for Guatemalan society, I think one of the most important things that could happen is just another validation that genocide actually occurred in Guatemala. It's the policy of the current government to deny that genocide occurred. And this is incredibly important for understanding the current social and economic situation of the country, whether we accept or deny that genocide occurred, as would be the case for United States and other North American nations.
How's the press handling
Yeah, the press coverage is always a little bit spotty. I think more so than just the coverage of what's happening, which has been okay, and it's front page news a lot of the time, has been sort of the opinion columns and discourse around it, especially around things like the Totonicapán massacre, for example. On the one hand, a huge outpouring of support for indigenous communities and the struggles that they're undergoing, and space within the national press to express that, and also a countercurrent of extreme racism that gets, it's not just in the comment pages online, which are awful, but published by Guatemalan newspapers, things like saying that the protesters of Totonicapán are the beast, and that the military fired on them in self-defense, and things like that. There's a pretty intense campaign, and actually that might be one of the next slides about the right-wing reaction against the cases. This is a photo from a march that was done by the military high command and their families, saying, thanks to soldiers and not reporters, we have a freedom of press. They had thanks to poets and not, thanks to soldiers, not poets, we have freedom of expression, which is ironic considering the Guatemalan military killed generations of poets, reporters, priests, etc. It's also interesting that this reaction has mostly taken place using the same civil society mechanisms as the movement for justice. So through nonviolent marches, through opinion columns, through public discourse, also intimidation and surveillance and court appearances, and orchestrated by groups who are known to have ties with both current and former military and military intelligence groups, but generally has been a reaction that's attempts to show itself as symmetrical in a lot of ways to the struggle for justice, which I think is a strategic decision by the military and its supporters not to just resort to the tactics of the past, because the rules of the game have changed under the current system, which is a bit what I'm trying to explain by talking about the shifts associated with neoliberalism following the conflict. Just a really quick overview of what previous convictions for crimes of the past have occurred. So the genocide trial doesn't come out of nowhere. And there's been a broad movement by survivors of state terror to hold accountable the material and intellectual authors of those crimes. Other than the genocide trials, the only other intellectual author, so the person who designed and gave the order to carry out terror, only the former national police chief, who's actually a civilian, has been convicted for that. No military, high military officials have been convicted as intellectual authors. And there are other cases that are pending, including a case that is historic on a world scale. The first case in which rape as a weapon of war is being judged in the country where that occurred for sexual enslavement of Kekchi women in a military base called Sepur Sarko. And I think the future is to, if the cases like genocide, for example, are able to put the high command in prison, that there may be a move down the chain of command to try to identify some of the mid-level authors, which is going to have a whole new set of threats for people engaged in those kinds of struggles. I mentioned the government's denial that genocide occurred. This is how Perez Molina, the current president, stated it last year or 2 years ago, and well, we're gonna see if it's proved or not by the courts. Just a quick overview of Perez Molina's resume, which I think is relevant, including things such as being chief of the Kabylie Special Forces School, which are the soldiers whose motto is "We are killing machines," and who carried out many massacres. He basically trained, at the very least, trained the people who carried out the massacres. It's known that he was chief of the military base in the Ashil region during the period of population control in the model villages. It's not publicly known where he was during the Scorched Earth massacres. And actually the Guatemalan Ministry of Defense just a couple weeks ago published an order saying that they would give information about the 1982 chain of command to the judge in the genocide case, but would reclassify it. So it's going to be even harder to figure out, for example, where he was. I also want to talk about, in addition to the indigenous survivors movement, an organization called HIJOS, which is Sons and Daughters for Identity and Justice Against Forgetting and Silence. It's a group that was founded in Argentina, and the Guatemalan chapter began in 1999, and this is the movement of young people, particularly in urban areas, who are the sons and daughters of people who were disappeared or exiled or who were underground in the guerrilla movement or who were attempting to organize human rights organizations. And I think the main thing I want to talk about what HIJOS does, in addition to things like their public campaigns to put the faces of the disappeared and other people killed by state terror all over the walls of Guatemala City and in other places, is to talk about the way that groups can come together from different political perspectives to work for common causes. So the Genocide Survivors Organization is Association for Justice and Reconciliation. HIJOS says we don't believe in reconciliation. They say neither forgiveness nor reconciliation nor forgetting, and yet they work together with the other survivors organization during the trials to support them with, they do media support, they do tons of political support, they're incredible levels of solidarity, despite having a different discourse. Just another way of articulating what I was talking about reconsidering what justice means. This is a excerpt from a poem by a member of HIJOS, and I'll just read the first part. It says, "Today I went out with rage at the world, and I call for punishment, I call for jail, stinking, dark, and cold, so that time without the sun will rot the bones of the murderer, the general who gave the order, who accepted in automatic silence, who did nothing to stop barbarism." And this is an organization that is profoundly influenced by the legacy of the revolutionary movement, and also in attempts to uphold the value of that struggle, but is also influenced by anti-authoritarian tendencies, but that has found a way to express that while also working to support groups working more within the system. So I think just trying to point out that there's not necessarily, doesn't have to be a struggle within the base of a social movement around those kind of questions in order to together reach important goals. They've also forged really important urban and rural alliances, both for justice and against militarization, using basically militant street protests to halt military day celebrations. And last year they moved that protest into a more rural environment in solidarity with communities that were rejecting the opening of a military base outside their territory, where there's a big struggle over the construction of a cement plant. And their analysis recapitulates what I talked about in the earlier slide about the habits of counterinsurgency and neoliberal dogma, in saying that formal democracy is in itself a strategy for domination, because it has not resulted in the enfranchisement in any real sense of the majority of the population, and has in fact resulted in the intensification of projects that threaten the very existence of those communities. The idea of memory itself as a disputed territory is something that has been very important in articulating the continuity of genocide, among other dynamics. And this has been developed by grassroots groups working with survivors of genocide to analyze and understand their experience of how it was lived on the ground. So this is two groups. Historical Memory Initiative is a loose collective of activists who are both international and Guatemalan, urban and rural, who meet with representatives of communities that survived genocide and that are working on the process of defending their communities in the present day. A coalition called People's Resistance that have developed these maps of territory that show the extent of plans for extractive industry and other projects. And I think one of the things that I learned as an accompanier and that our accompaniment movements have had to react to is that communities who we have accompanied for years and as part of the struggle for justice have started to say, well, actually our biggest concern isn't whether the general goes on trial, but whether or not they're going to build a dam that will destroy our community. So the existential threat to communities and to existence is not in the immediate frame that they'll be attacked by the army because they're struggling for justice, but that their land will be sold out from under them and they'll be displaced by economic development projects. And so these movements for territorial defense have basically grown out of that concern for the very terms of survival, whether communities have access to land and water and other natural resources that are being bought up. One of the ways this has been done is through the movement for consultas, for popular consultations about these kinds of projects. And this has been a movement across the highlands, particularly of Guatemala. And I think what is interesting and important about this is the fact that communities are saying, well, this international law exists that says the government has to consult us about any project that will affect our territory. The government's not doing that. So how do we ourselves from the bottom up implement the vision of international law as we understand it? And so they've worked through local governments to basically obligate local municipal governments to carry out consultas saying, does the population want a mine, for example? And then voting on it using traditional methods, which may include, voting by hand or ballot or whatever. And across the spectrum, in the more than 60 consultations that have been held, in every case, a vast majority says no, and have had the participation of majorities of the people in the territory in which they're carried out. The Guatemalan Constitutional Court has said that the consultations are legal but non-binding. So you can do whatever you want, but we don't have to listen to you. And this is what is also behind movements for indigenous rights across the hemisphere. This is behind what is happening in Canada with the Idle No More movement. And what I think is really interesting about what's happened in Guatemala is that it's a bottom-up appropriation of international law, saying that this is how we're going to carry it out, and then there will be a longer struggle to make sure that it's respected. And I think that that's a step towards decolonization, in a way, to take the structures that exist and say the way that they're understood by the dominant force is not the right way, but that we're going to implement them in the way that we believe as communities. And that's expressed, I think, quite clearly in this quote from a member of the Quiche People's Council, which is an organization that has carried out several consultations. This is another image that shows just the extent of the amount of the country that could be affected by, this is just mining. In 2008, this is a draft of requests for mining licenses that were granted or requested at that time, and you can see that it's a huge section of the country. If you add in dams, if you add in oil, if you add in African palm and agro-industry to that, it's the huge percentage of the country that is up for bidding, basically, for private companies. This is a map of the extent of the consultations. You can see they're mostly in the majority indigenous areas of the country. Some areas of the country have been declared free of mining, for example, following these consultations. And they've been met by significant amount of intimidation by military and by local powers that are not favorable to territorial defense. And why are people concerned? I mean, I think a lot of the reasons are maybe clear. Besides harms to the environment, there are harms to health, including, for example, Physicians for Human Rights found that people living downstream from the Marlin mine in San Marcos had significantly higher concentrations of potentially toxic heavy metals in their bloodstream. People have said that since companies come in, their crops fail, that they complain of skin ailments. Also, just the pressure caused by enclosure. This is a picture of Don Clodo, whose literally his entire property was surrounded by and fenced off by a mine, except for the part that he refused to sell. And beyond just that extremely direct example of enclosure, just the whole change in land markets that occurs when there's so much pressure to buy those up. And also securitization as companies bring in private security, which have been responsible for things such as the killing last May of community leaders in Barrias who were resisting the implementation of actually a very small hydroelectric dam, 10 megawatts. But some local leaders who refused to sell their land and who were involved in the territorial defense organizing were killed by security guards of the dam company. And I wanted to point out in this photo, the cross says, here is where Andres Francisco Miguel was murdered. It says, "Yes to life, no to death, hero and martyr." And that slogan might seem banal in a certain way, just yes to life, no to death, but really I think it captures what the terms of the struggle are, which are for survival of communities that are faced with these projects. And that's how people see it. That's how it's from community to community expressed. Yes, rivers for life, not for death, in the case of dam projects. And the response to the riots that followed the murder of those activists was the state of siege declared in the municipality of Barrias. People were forced to flee into the mountains. Homes were ransacked. More than a dozen political prisoners. A dozen leaders were arrested and were just released last January, some 7 months later. And people saw this as a return in many ways to the dynamics of the counterinsurgency. But as I said earlier, sort of more low-level state terror as opposed to outright scorched earth, but with the same eventual objective to pacify and control the population so that it submits to the will of the state, basically, and its interests. This is a lovely picture of Perez Molina and the way he understood human rights in the context of states of emergency. The state of siege does not violate human rights because rights have been suspended. It's easy enough. And so we think about if that level of repression that came out to opposition to a 10 megawatt dam. Well, one of the proposed projects, the Shalala Dam, would be the second largest in the country at 181 megawatts. It would have a reservoir of more than 15 square miles affecting more than 58 communities. And the government has just announced again that it plans to open bidding for that project next year. They already did in 2008, but it failed because no company actually wanted to take on the responsibility of having to consult with communities that had already said, we don't want the project. So the government has done a whole series of social studies which they claim have consulted the population, but I actually accompanied in these communities, and the folks there had not had any contact with government representatives consulting them about this project that they say they're going to be putting up for bidding next year. This is a picture of dam construction a few years back in another site. And actually these pictures were of the change in 3 years between, this picture is one that was taken on a visit that I did in 2008, and this 3 years later after dam construction began upstream, the river is totally muddy, cloudy, dirty. People complained that it was causing skin irritation, that they couldn't clean clothes. People rely on fishing, among other forms of subsistence in those communities. So the impacts start even before construction begins, and then once construction begins, begin to ramp up. This was a huge, you can't really see it here, but this was where the slogan said, yes to, rivers for life, not for death. They made a huge slogan with rocks so that it could be seen on flyovers. And I think another harm that is important to talk about, in addition to affecting livelihood of communities, it also affects the cultural values and cosmovision of communities, and the Mayan spirituality is very deeply interwoven with these struggles for resistance. This is a ceremony at the site where the Shalala Dam would be constructed during one of the meetings of the local association that's attempting to block the construction of the dam. And also other political events that have been held at archaeological sites, sacred sites. And so we're not going to spend a ton of time on these different maps. These are all available at the Resistencia de los Pueblos website that just show the extent of all these projects across the country. And the involvement of capital from around the world. It's not just a imperialist U.S. imposition, but from the global south as well. There's actually not a good example here, but for example, the energy distribution network, which the people of Totonicapán were protesting against, is now owned by a Colombian company. There's also, from Russia, investment in mining, but the majority of mining investment comes through Canada and the United States. Some of the dam investment is interesting enough from Honduras, as well as local capital. And some of the other tactics that have been used to oppose these projects, in addition to organizing in national civil society with the Catholic Church. Some folks have tried negotiations with the state that haven't generally resulted in significant change on the ground. One of the cases that is going to be that has become one of the most celebrated is the blockade of La Puya, which is communities that are resisting a gold mine owned by U.S. and Canadian companies. Since last March, they've been out there every single day, not allowing any vehicles of the mining company to enter, and have faced repression from the police, as well as provocation by the mining company itself, hiring the guy in yellow hat as a former military officer, and they basically paid people to come out and intimidate the people at the blockade. And I could show video from it, but I'm talking way over what I wanted to. Using homophobic threats, insults. Some people appeared to be on drunk or on drugs who they brought out, and very attempt to provoke violence that was resisted by the people in the blockade. And this quote is from Yolanda Okeli, who's a local leader who was actually shot last May and survived, and continues to be a strong representative of the resistance there, talking about the role of women in the struggle in an interesting way, as well as solidarity with men who have learned not to be machista. I just want to talk about one other example of creative resistance protagonized by women. Crisanta in this picture was living next to the Goldcorp's Marlin mine in San Marcos. They put an electrical post on her land that she said she wasn't consulted about. And so one day she got sick of it and tied a wire to 2 rocks, threw them over the power line, and cut the power to the whole mine for a month. And she and the women who supported her had legal threats from the mine for years following that, were not able to leave their homes, were extremely persecuted by the mine, but actually finally had charges against them dropped in the last few years, and removed the mining post from Crisanta's land at least, although the project continues. And actually it's possible that the charges were dropped because in general resistance to the mine in that area has begun to become less cohesive in some ways. But so I wanted to close on a hopeful quote that came out of the celebrations last year of the opening of the 13th cycle of the Mayan calendar. I'm sure a lot of you heard about the Mayan calendar last year in ways that were not particularly appropriate. But this was celebrated in a very profound way by groups in Guatemala. And this is a quote that came out of that, saying basically, articulating what people are struggling for, not just struggling against. And this is the alternative of a way of life based in collective well-being and self-determination. And as the person from the CPK says, we don't see this as a utopia, but as something that we understand and believe as the experience of our own communities that has survived for so long. And I guess I want to close on that with a photo from some of those celebrations. And it would be great to have some discussion if people are not totally exhausted. I know I was trying to cover a lot, and I wanted to talk about students and some other things, but didn't get to it. So just plug this book that's coming out in a bit that I and some folks from NISGUA had the ability to contribute to, and there's information about that on the table. Until the Rulers Obey is coming out in PM Press, and it has a chapter that draws on interviews conducted by the Accompaniment project, and give you some more resources. I'll go back to this so you can write them down in a minute. And if you want to get in touch with me, I have my blog at cascadiasolidaria.wordpress.com, and I can get emails. But thanks. I hope that I was able to, at least we'll see what conversation comes up in the discussion. Thanks.